First story, the Robert Taylor Incident, Scotland, 1979. It was just another ordinary Tuesday morning when I decided to take my usual walk through the dense woods near my home in Livingston, Scotland. The crisp November air nipped at my cheeks as I trudged along the familiar dirt path, the fallen leaves crunching beneath my worn work boots. I'd walked this route countless times before, savoring the peaceful solitude and the earthy scent of the forest. But on that fateful day, November 9th, 1979, something felt off. I can't explain it, but there was a palpable tension in the atmosphere, as if the very air around me was charged with an otherworldly energy. The birds had fallen silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As I approached the clearing, where I often paused to rest, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But curiosity, or perhaps some unseen force, propelled me forward. I pushed through the last cluster of trees, and that's when I saw it. The sight that would forever change my life and haunt my dreams for years to come. Hovering silently about 20 feet above the ground was an enormous metallic sphere, easily 20 feet in diameter. It defied all logic and everything I thought I knew about the world. The object was perfectly smooth, with no visible seams or markings. It reflected the weak Scottish sunlight with an otherworldly sheen, almost as if it were made of liquid metal. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind reeling as it tried to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Was this some kind of military experiment? A hallucination? But deep down, I knew this was something far beyond human technology or understanding. As I gaped in awe and terror, the sphere began to emit a low, pulsing hum that I could feel reverberating in my chest. The air around it seemed to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. And then, without warning, two smaller objects detached from the sides of the craft with a sickening mechanical sound. These things were unlike anything I'd ever seen before or since. About the size of barrels, they appeared to be some kind of autonomous robots or drones. They had a central spherical body, bristling with sharp metallic spikes and multiple extending arms or appendages. As they rolled towards me across the forest floor with terrifying speed and precision, I finally snapped out of my paralysis. I tried to run, to scramble back into the safety of the trees, but my legs felt like lead. It was as if the very air had become thick and resistant, slowing my movements to a nightmarish crawl. I heard the whirring and clicking of the mechanical monstrosities behind me, growing louder with each passing second. My heart pounded in my ears as panic overtook me. Just as I thought I might make it to the tree line, I felt something latch onto my legs with crushing force. The pain was immediate and intense, like being stabbed by dozens of white-hot needles. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the eerie silence of the forest. The spiked appendages dug into my flesh as the machines began to drag me backwards towards the hovering sphere. I clawed desperately at the ground, my fingers digging into the cold earth as I tried to resist the inexorable pull. But it was futile. These things, whatever they were, possessed strength far beyond anything human. As I was dragged across the bow, clearing, leaves and twigs tearing at my clothes and skin, I caught a glimpse of the sphere above me. Its surface had begun to ripple and shift, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. A section of the craft seemed to liquefy, forming a dark, gaping maw. The sight filled me with a primal terror, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I redoubled my efforts to break free, thrashing and kicking with all my might. but the machine's grip was unrelenting. As we neared the sphere, I felt a strange tingling sensation spreading throughout my body. My vision began to blur and waver, the edges of reality seeming to fray. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was an overwhelming feeling of vertigo, as if I were falling into an endless abyss. I have no idea how much time passed. When I finally came to, I found myself lying face down on the cold, damp ground of the clearing. My head throbbed with a pain so intense it made me nauseous, and every inch of my body ached as if I'd been beaten. As I struggled to push myself up, I became aware of a sticky wetness on my face and realized my nose was bleeding profusely. My clothes were in tatters, ripped and stained with a mixture of dirt, blood, and some strange viscous substance I couldn't identify. As I managed to sit up, fighting waves of dizziness, I noticed bizarre markings all over my exposed skin. They looked like a cross between burn marks and intricate geometric patterns, nothing like any injury I'd ever seen before. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, but there were significant gaps in my memory. I remembered the sphere, the terrifying machines being dragged across the ground. And then, nothing. A blank void where hours of my life should have been. Panic set in as I realized the full gravity of my situation. I staggered to my feet, nearly falling as my legs trembled beneath me. The clearing looked different somehow. The grass was flattened in a perfect circle where the sphere had hovered, and there were strange, symmetrical indentations in the soil that didn't match any tire tracks or footprints I'd ever seen. As I stumbled towards the edge of the woods, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My watch had stopped at 10:30 a.m., the approximate time I'd entered the clearing. But now, the weak sunlight filtering through the trees told me it was late afternoon. I had lost nearly 6 hours of time. What had happened to me during those missing hours? What had those things done to me? I made my way home in a daze, each step sending jolts of pain through my battered body. When I finally reached my house, I collapsed on the doorstep, barely able to call out for help. My wife found me there, and her scream of horror when she saw my condition is something I'll never forget. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion, fear, and disbelief. My wife had called for an ambulance and I was rushed to the hospital. The doctors were baffled by my injuries and the strange markings on my skin. They ran test after test, drawing blood, taking x-rays and peppering me with questions I couldn't answer. How do you explain to medical professionals that you were abducted by some kind of alien craft? I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances when I tried to describe what had happened. They chalked it up to some kind of trauma-induced hallucination, suggesting that perhaps I had been attacked by an animal or fallen and hit my head. But I knew the truth, even if I couldn't fully comprehend it myself. The police were called in to investigate, and I led them back to the clearing where it had all happened. The flattened grass was still there, as were the strange indentations in the ground. The officers took photographs and measurements, but I could tell they were just going through the motions. To them, this was probably just another case of a local nutter having a breakdown in the woods. As word of my experience spread, my life became a living hell. Reporters camped outside my house, shouting questions and snapping photos whenever I dared to step outside. My co-workers at the forestry department treated me with a mixture of pity and derision. Some thought I was lying for attention, Others believed I had finally cracked under the pressure of the job. Even some of my closest friends began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the notoriety my story had brought. I couldn't blame them, really. If our roles were reversed, would I have believed such an outlandish tale? The worst part was the nightmares. Every night I would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. In my dreams, I was back in that clearing, being dragged towards the sphere. But in these nightmares I never lost consciousness. Instead, I was pulled inside, subjected to terrifying experiments by shadowy, inhuman figures. I would wake up screaming, my body aching as if I had really been there. My wife tried to be supportive, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, the whispers and stares whenever we went out in public. It was slowly tearing our marriage apart. As the weeks turned into months, I became obsessed with trying to understand what had happened to me. I pored over every book on UFOs and alien encounters I could get my hands on, searching for similar cases or any kind of explanation. I reached out to ufologists and paranormal researchers, desperate for validation or answers. Some were sympathetic and eager to hear my story, while others dismissed me as just another crackpot. I began to question my own sanity. Had it all been some kind of vivid hallucination, a psychotic break? But then I would look at the scars on my legs where those mechanical arms had gripped me, touch the strange, raised patterns on my skin that refused to fade, and I knew it had been real. The missing time haunted me most of all. What had happened during those lost hours? Had they taken me aboard their craft, performed experiments, implanted something in me? I underwent hypnosis sessions, hoping to recover my buried memories, but they only left me with more questions than answers. Fragmented images of sterile metallic rooms, long-fingered hands, and glowing instruments flashed through my mind, but I couldn't piece them together into a coherent narrative. The more I pushed, the more elusive the memories became, slipping away like wisps of smoke. As time passed, the intensity of public interest in my case began to wane, but the impact on my life remained profound. I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate at work, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every unexpected sound. The forest, once a place of solace and familiarity, now filled me with dread. Every time I ventured near the trees, my heart would race and I'd break out in a cold sweat. I tried to push through it, telling myself it was irrational, but the fear was crippling. Eventually, I had to take a leave of absence from my job. The constant strain had taken its toll on my mental and physical health. I lost weight, developed insomnia, and found myself spiraling into depression. My wife, bless her, tried her best to support me, but I could see the toll it was taking on her as well. Our conversations became strained, filled with long silences and unspoken worries. I felt like I was dragging her down with me, but I didn't know how to pull myself out of this pit I'd fallen into. About 6 months after the incident, something happened that shook me to my core. I was home alone one evening, my wife having gone to visit her sister for the weekend. As I sat in front of the television, not really watching, just trying to distract myself from my tumultuous thoughts, the lights in the house began to flicker. At first, I dismissed it as a power surge, but then I noticed a low, familiar hum building in intensity. It was the same sound I'd heard in the clearing that day. panic gripped me as I stumbled to the window, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. Outside, hovering just above the treetops, was a pulsing light. It wasn't the same craft I'd seen before. This one was smaller, more disc-like, but I knew instinctively it was connected. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, a beam of brilliant white light shot down from the craft, sweeping across my yard and then my house. The moment the light touched me, I felt that same tingling sensation I'd experienced in the clearing. My vision blurred, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. I fought against it with every ounce of my being, terrified of what might happen if I blacked out again. The last thing I remember is collapsing to the floor, my fingernails scraping against the windowsill as I tried desperately to hold on. I came to what felt like hours later, finding myself curled up in a fetal position on the living room floor. The house was dark and silent, the television nothing but static. As I pushed myself up, groaning at the stiffness in my muscles, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The clock on the wall showed it was just past midnight, but the calendar next to it indicated it was now Sunday. I had lost an entire day. Panic rising in my throat, I scrambled for my phone, finding dozens of missed calls and frantic text messages from my wife. She had come home Saturday afternoon to find the house empty, with no sign of where I'd gone. I called her immediately, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. But how could I? How could I tell her that it had happened again, that they had come for me again? As I listened to her tearful relief at hearing my voice, mixed with confusion and fear, I felt something inside me break. I couldn't keep doing this to her, to us. I couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for the next encounter, the next blackout, the next chunk of my life to be stolen away. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I couldn't stay in Livingston anymore. Every shadow, every unexpected sound, every flicker of light sent me into a panic. The forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a looming threat, a constant reminder of what had happened to me. My wife, bless her heart, agreed that we needed a fresh start. We sold our house, packed up our belongings, and moved to the bustling heart of Glasgow. The noise and chaos of the city were a stark contrast to the quiet of our former home, but I found comfort in the constant activity. Here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I felt safer. The tall buildings and bright lights seemed to form a protective barrier against the vast, unknowable darkness of space. But even as I tried to rebuild my life, the memories of what had happened haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, on clear nights, I would find myself staring up at the stars, a mixture of fear and longing twisting in my gut. Part of me wanted answers, wanted to understand what had happened and why, but a larger part just wanted to forget, to pretend it had all been a bad dream. As the years passed, I struggled to find a semblance of normalcy. I took a job as a night security guard at a local factory. The irony of watching for intruders wasn't lost on me, but the quiet, solitary nature of the work suited my frayed nerves. My wife and I tried to have children, hoping it would help us move forward, but it never happened. Sometimes I wondered if whatever had been done to me during those missing hours had affected my ability to have kids. The thought filled me with a deep, aching sadness and a renewed anger at the beings who had upended my life. I sought out therapy, trying to work through the trauma and anxiety that still plagued me. It helped, to a degree. I learned coping mechanisms, ways to ground myself when the panic started to rise. But there were still nights when I would wake up screaming, my body drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of cold metallic appendages gripping my legs. On those nights, my wife would hold me tightly, murmuring soothing words until the shaking subsided. Her unwavering support was the one constant in my life, the anchor that kept me from drifting completely into despair. It's been over 4 decades since that day in the clearing, and I'm now an old man. My hair has gone gray, my joints ache with arthritis, and my once sharp eyesight has dimmed. But the memories of what happened haven't faded. If anything, they've become more vivid with time, as if my mind is desperately trying to fill in the blanks, to make sense of the inexplicable. I've had no more encounters since that night in our old house, no more missing time or strange lights in the sky. But the impact of those experiences has shaped every aspect of my life. I've never been able to shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that at any moment they might return to finish whatever it was they started. I've become something of a recluse in my old age, rarely venturing out of our small Glasgow flat. My dear wife passed away 2 years ago, and without her steadying presence, I've found myself slipping back into old fears and paranoid thoughts. I spend hours scouring the internet for similar stories, for any scrap of information that might help me understand what happened to me. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better never to have walked into that clearing that day, to have lived a normal, unremarkable life, ignorant of the terrifying realities that exist beyond our understanding. As I sit here, typing out this account for the first time in its entirety, I'm struck by a mix of emotions. There's fear, of course, fear that by sharing this, I might somehow draw their attention again. But there's also a sense of relief, of unburdening myself after all these years. And beneath it all, there's a persistent, gnawing need to know. What were those beings? What did they want with me? Why me? These questions have consumed me for most of my life, and I know I'll likely go to my grave without answers. But perhaps by sharing my story, someone out there might recognize similar experiences. Maybe, just maybe, by piecing together our fragmented memories and encounters, we can start to make sense of these phenomena that defy explanation. To those who read this and scoff, dismissing it as the ramblings of a senile old man or an attention seeker, I say this: I envy you. I envy your certainty, your unshakable belief in a rational, explainable world. But to those who read this and feel a chill of recognition, who have gazed up at the night sky and felt both wonder and terror, I say, you are not alone. Whatever is out there, whatever visited me in that Scottish clearing all those years ago, it's real. And it's still out there, watching, waiting. Stay vigilant, and may you never experience the terror of feeling utterly powerless in the face of something so vastly beyond our comprehension. Second story, The Night They Chose Me, Upstate New York, 1999. It was just another ordinary night in my small town in upstate New York. The year was 1999, and I was driving home from my late shift at the local diner. The roads were empty, a thick fog settling over the fields on either side of the highway. I remember feeling exhausted, my eyes heavy with fatigue as I navigated the familiar curves of the road. The radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show discussing the upcoming new millennium. I wasn't really paying attention, my mind drifting to thoughts of my warm bed waiting for me at home. That's when it happened. The first thing I noticed, was the static on the radio. It started as a soft crackle, barely noticeable over the host's voice. But within seconds, it grew louder, drowning out everything else. I reached to adjust the dial, thinking it was just interference, but my hand froze mid-air. The entire car went silent, not just the radio, but the engine too. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, a chill running down my spine as I realized the headlights had also gone out. I sat there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a strange reflection in my rearview mirror. A faint, bluish glow seemed to be coming from behind me. I turned around, expecting to see another car's headlights, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Hovering above the road, maybe 100 yards behind my car, was an enormous disc-shaped object. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The craft, if you could call it that, was at least the size of a football field, its metallic surface reflecting the eerie blue light that seemed to emanate from its core. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no logical explanation. This wasn't a plane, a helicopter, or any kind of conventional aircraft. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the object began to move closer. It made no sound, gliding through the air with an impossible grace for something of its size. The blue light grew brighter, illuminating the fog around it and casting long, distorted shadows across the fields. I wanted to run, to get out of my car and flee into the darkness, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I was frozen in place, a spectator to this unbelievable scene unfolding before me. As the craft drew nearer, I began to feel a strange pressure in my head. It started as a dull ache, but quickly intensified into a searing pain that felt like my skull was being split open. I closed my eyes, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, silently praying for this to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but real. When I opened my eyes again, the world around me had changed. I was no longer in my car on that foggy road. Instead, I found myself in a vast, circular room. The walls, if you could call them that, seemed to be made of a material that shifted and swirled with an iridescent sheen. It was as if I was inside a giant soap bubble, colors dancing and changing before my eyes. The floor beneath me was solid, but had a strange, almost organic feel to it. It pulsed with a faint rhythmic glow like a heartbeat. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, as if gravity itself had increased. That's when I noticed them. They stood in a semicircle around me, their forms unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. They were tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with bodies that seemed to shimmer and shift, never quite settling into a definite shape. Their skin, if you could call it that, was a pale, luminescent blue that seemed to glow from within. But it was their eyes that truly terrified me. They were huge, taking up most of their face and completely black. Not just dark, but an absence of light, like looking into the depths of space itself. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. And then, without warning, their voices filled my mind. The voices were not audible, in the traditional sense. It was more like they were inside my head, a cacophony of thoughts and emotions that weren't my own. At first, it was overwhelming, like trying to listen to 100 different conversations at once, but gradually, the chaos began to coalesce into something more coherent. They were communicating with me, not through words, but through images and sensations. I saw Earth from space, a beautiful blue marble suspended in the void. But as I watched, the image changed. I saw massive storms ravaging coastlines, forests burning, entire cities swallowed by rising seas. I felt the pain of a dying planet, the anguish of countless species facing extinction. The visions were so vivid, so real, that I could almost smell the smoke and taste the ash in the air. Then, just as suddenly, the images shifted again. I saw advanced technologies beyond my comprehension, machines that could clean the air and water, energy sources that didn't pollute, ways to regrow forests and restore ecosystems. But alongside these marvels, I also saw darker things. Weapons, capable of destroying entire continents, devices that could control minds and bend reality itself. The aliens, for I knew now without a doubt that's what they were showing me potential futures, paths humanity could take. As the flood of information continued, I began to understand their purpose. They weren't here to invade or conquer. They were observers, watchers who had been studying Earth and its inhabitants for millennia. And now, they were reaching out, because they saw us at a crucial turning point. Humanity stood on the brink of either self-destruction or a great leap forward, and our actions in the coming years would determine which path we took. The aliens couldn't interfere directly. Some cosmic law or ethical code prevented them from doing so. But they could warn us, show us what was at stake. I felt their urgency, their concern for our planet and our species. It was overwhelming, almost paternal in its intensity. As this realization washed over me, I felt my fear begin to subside, replaced by a sense of awe and responsibility. These beings had chosen me for whatever reason to receive this message. But even as I tried to process everything I was experiencing, a new sensation began to creep in. A pressure was building in my head, starting as a dull ache but quickly intensifying. The images and sensations became jumbled, fragmenting like a broken mirror. I could feel myself slipping away, my consciousness struggling to hold on to the alien presence in my mind. Just when I thought my head would explode from the pressure, everything stopped. The alien voices, the visions, the strange room, it all vanished in an instant. I found myself back in my car, on the side of the road where this incredible journey had begun. The fog was still thick, the night just as dark as before, but something had changed. The silence was deafening after the mental cacophony I had experienced. My whole body was shaking, covered in a cold sweat. I looked at the clock on my dashboard. Only 10 minutes had passed since I first saw the strange light. It felt impossible. Surely I had been gone for hours, maybe even days. I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The car started on the first try, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. The radio came back to life, the late-night host still droning on about Y2K preparations. It was surreal, like waking up from an incredibly vivid dream. But I knew it wasn't a dream. The memory of what I had seen and felt was too vivid, too real to be dismissed so easily. As I pulled back onto the road and started driving home, my mind was reeling. How could I possibly explain this to anyone? Who would believe me? The weight of the knowledge I now possessed felt crushing. I had been given a glimpse of humanity's potential future, both the promise and the peril. And I had no idea what to do with that information. The days that followed my encounter were a blur of confusion and anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now part of something much bigger than myself, something that extended far beyond our planet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the visions the aliens had shown me, cities underwater, forests reduced to ash, but also glimpses of incredible technological advancements and harmony with nature. It was like having a window into two very different futures, and the responsibility of that knowledge weighed heavily on me. I tried to go about my normal routine, serving coffee and burgers at the diner, but everything felt different. The mundane concerns of my customers, complaining about cold fries or gossiping about local drama, seemed so trivial in comparison to what I now knew. I found myself staring at people, wondering if they had any idea how close we were to the brink, how our actions now could shape the fate of our entire species. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't talk to anyone about what had happened. I knew how it would sound. Claims of alien abduction were met with ridicule at best, and concern for one's mental health at worst. Even my closest friends would probably think I had lost my mind. So I kept it all bottled up inside, the pressure building with each passing day. About a week after my encounter, I finally broke down and tried to tell someone. I chose my best friend, Sarah, figuring if anyone would give me the benefit of the doubt, it would be her. We met at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes and ears. I took a deep breath and started from the beginning, describing the strange light on the road, the silent spacecraft, and the otherworldly beings I had encountered. I told her about the visions they had shown me, the warnings about our planet's future. As I spoke, I could see the concern growing in Sarah's eyes. She listened patiently, not interrupting, but I could tell she didn't believe a word of it. When I finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. "Richard," she said gently, "I think you might be under a lot of stress. Have you considered talking to someone professional about this?" Her words, though kind, felt like a punch to the gut. I pulled my hand away, suddenly angry. "I'm not crazy, Sarah," I snapped. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real." But even as I said it, I could hear how it sounded. Wild, unbelievable, insane. I left the coffee shop feeling more alone than ever, the gulf between what I knew and what others would accept seeming impossibly wide. As weeks turned into months, the intensity of my experience began to fade, but the impact lingered. I became obsessed with environmental issues, devouring every piece of information I could find about climate change, deforestation, and pollution. I started volunteering for local conservation efforts, trying in my own small way to push humanity towards the more positive future I had glimpsed. But it never felt like enough. The aliens' warning echoed in my mind constantly. We were running out of time. I found myself growing increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of change, the reluctance of people to take the threats to our planet seriously. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing the disaster that was coming but being powerless to stop it. I started having nightmares, vivid dreams where I relived my encounter over and over but with different outcomes. Sometimes the aliens were menacing, their intentions not as benevolent as I had initially believed. Other times, I saw myself trying to warn crowds of people about the coming dangers, but my voice was always drowned out by the noise and distractions of everyday life. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the line between dream and reality becoming increasingly blurred. The worst part was the doubt that began to creep in. As time passed and nothing else extraordinary happened, I started to question my own memories. Had it really happened the way I remembered? Or had my mind somehow fabricated the entire experience? As the new millennium approached, my obsession with my alien encounter reached a fever pitch. The world was abuzz with Y2K fears and celebrations, but all I could think about were the visions I had been shown. I became convinced that the turn of the century would bring some sort of sign or validation of my experience. I spent New Year's Eve alone, perched on the roof of my apartment building, scanning the sky for any hint of the otherworldly visitors. But as the clock struck midnight and fireworks lit up the sky, there was nothing. No UFOs, no telepathic messages, no world-changing events. Just the sounds of celebration and the start of another ordinary year. The anticlimax hit me hard. I spiraled into a deep depression, questioning everything I thought I knew. Had it all been a vivid hallucination? A stress-induced breakdown? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed in some crucial way, that I had missed an opportunity to make a difference. The weight of the potential futures I had seen, both the devastating and the inspiring, felt like it was crushing me. I withdrew from friends and family, barely able to function in my day-to-day life. The diner job that had once been my anchor now felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of how small and insignificant my life was in the grand scheme of things. It was during this low point, about 6 months into the new millennium, that something happened to reignite my belief. I was walking home late one night, having picked up an extra shift at the diner. The streets were empty, the town quiet under a clear, star-filled sky. As I passed by the local park, something caught my eye. A flash of blue light, just like the one I had seen on that fateful night. My heart began to race as I turned towards the park, half expecting to see the massive spacecraft hovering above the trees. But what I saw instead was even more startling. There, sitting on a bench under a streetlight, was a man. Or at least it looked like a man at first glance. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. His skin had an odd bluish tinge, and his eyes were completely black, just like the aliens I had encountered. He turned to look at me, and in that moment, I felt the same rush of images and sensations I had experienced during my abduction. Flashes of natural disasters, technological marvels, and cosmic wonders flooded my mind. But this time, there was something else too. A sense of encouragement, of validation, a feeling that I wasn't alone, that my experiences were real, and that my efforts, however small, mattered. The encounter lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it ended, the man, or whatever he was, simply stood up and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to follow him, to demand answers to the countless questions that had been tormenting me. But another part knew that this brief interaction was all I was meant to have. As I finally managed to shake off my stupor and continue home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The depression that had been weighing me down for months began to lift. I realized that even if I couldn't convince others of what I had experienced, I could still act on the knowledge I had been given. The next day, I threw myself back into my environmental volunteering with renewed vigor. I started researching sustainable technologies and practices, looking for ways to implement them in my own life and community. I may not have been able to change the world single-handedly, but I could be a part of the change. A small push towards the more positive future I had glimpsed. As the years passed, my life took on a new rhythm. By day, I continued working at the diner, saving up money and quietly observing the ebb and flow of small-town life. But in my free time, I became a passionate advocate for environmental causes. I organized local cleanup efforts, started a community garden, and even managed to convince the town council to implement more eco-friendly policies. It wasn't earth-shattering change, but it felt like I was doing something, pushing back against the darker future I had seen. The memory of my encounter remained vivid, a constant reminder of what was at stake. I never saw the strange man in the park again, but I often felt like I was being watched, guided in some subtle way. Sometimes, when I was alone in nature, I would feel a familiar pressure in my head, a fleeting connection to something vast and incomprehensible. These moments were rare and brief, but they kept me going, reassuring me that I wasn't alone in my mission. Despite my efforts to move forward, the experience had fundamentally changed me. I found it hard to relate to people who weren't aware of the bigger picture, who couldn't see beyond their immediate concerns. Relationships became difficult. How could I open up to someone when I couldn't share the most profound experience of my life? I dated occasionally, but it never lasted long. The secret I carried created an invisible barrier, a distance I couldn't bridge. One day, about 5 years after my initial encounter, I stumbled upon an online forum dedicated to UFO sightings and alien encounters. At first I was skeptical. Most of the stories seemed far-fetched, clearly fabricated for attention. But as I dug deeper, I found a few accounts that resonated with my own experience. People who described similar craft, beings with black eyes, and visions of potential futures. I created an anonymous account and hesitantly shared my story, expecting ridicule or dismissal. To my surprise, I received a flood of supportive messages. Some shared their own similar experiences, while others simply expressed gratitude for my courage in speaking out. For the first time since that night on the foggy road, I felt understood. I became a regular on the forum, connecting with others who had encountered the unexplainable. We shared theories, compared notes, and offered each other support. It wasn't the same as being able to talk openly about my experience, but it provided a much-needed outlet. Through these connections, I learned that there were others out there working towards the same goals, inspired by their own otherworldly encounters. It gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, we could collectively make a difference. As technology advanced and concerns about climate change became more mainstream, I often found myself thinking back to the visions I had been shown. Some of the disasters I had glimpsed seemed to be unfolding in real time. Increasingly powerful storms, unprecedented wildfires, rising sea levels. But I also saw glimmers of the positive future, renewable energy becoming more prevalent, conservation, efforts gaining traction, a growing awareness of our impact on the planet. It was a constant race against time, hope battling against despair. There were moments when I wondered if I should try to go public with my story, to use my experience as a way to motivate others to take action. But every time I considered it, I remembered the look in Sarah's eyes when I had tried to tell her, the pitying disbelief. I knew that going public would likely do more harm than good, discrediting the very causes I was trying to support. So I continued my work quietly, hoping that my actions would speak louder than any words could. As I approached middle age, I found myself becoming something of a local eccentric, the diner waiter who was always talking about recycling and sustainable living. Some people listened, others dismissed me as a tree hugger or a conspiracy theorist. But I persevered, knowing that even if I could influence just a few people, it could create a ripple effect of positive change. Now, as I sit here writing this account, it's been over 2 decades since that night that changed everything. The world has changed in ways both wonderful and terrifying. We've made progress in some areas, while other problems have only gotten worse. I still don't know why I was chosen for that encounter, why those beings decided to share their message with me. There are nights when I look up at the stars and wonder if they're still out there, watching and waiting to see what path we'll choose. I've never had another experience as profound as that first encounter, but I've never stopped feeling its effects. It's shaped every aspect of my life, driven every decision I've made. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had never taken that late-night drive, if I had never seen that strange blue light. Would I have been happier, living in blissful ignorance? Or would I have eventually found my way to this path regardless? I'll never know. All I can do is continue to work towards the better future I was shown, to be a small force for positive change in whatever way I can. And if there's anyone out there reading this who has had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. The truth is out there, and it's up to us to shape it. We may not be able to change the world overnight, but every small action, every choice we make, ripples out in ways we can't always see. So keep pushing, keep striving, keep believing. The future isn't set in stone, it's in our hands. And who knows? Maybe someday we'll look up at the stars and see not distant, unreachable points of light, but the promise of a vast, interconnected universe waiting for us to join it. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, Taken. A Fisherman's Nightmare, Brazil, 1969. The day started like any other, with the salty breeze caressing my face as I made my way down to the shore. Fishing had always been my solace, a way to escape the mundane grind of everyday life in our small coastal town. But there was something off about that morning. A stillness in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake off the feeling as I loaded my gear into the small boat, convincing myself it was just nerves from the recent rumors circulating about strange lights in the sky. The ocean stretched out before me, vast and inviting, yet somehow more ominous than I'd ever seen it. As I pushed off from the shore, the familiar rhythm of the waves usually calmed my mind, but today it only served to heighten my sense of unease. The fish weren't biting, which was unusual for this time of year. Hours passed, and I found myself drifting further from the coast than I'd intended, lost in thought and surrounded by an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. It wasn't until the sun began to dip towards the horizon that I realized how late it had gotten. I decided to call it a day and head back, disappointed by the empty cooler, but eager to return to the safety of solid ground. That's when I saw them, figures standing on the shore silhouetted against the fading light. At first I thought it must be other fishermen or maybe some kids playing on the beach. But as I drew closer, I realized with a growing sense of dread that these were unlike any people I'd ever seen before. My heart began to race as the details came into focus. They were small, no taller than children, but their proportions were all wrong. Their bodies were thin and elongated, with skin that seemed to shimmer in the twilight. But it was their faces that made my blood run cold. Huge almond-shaped eyes dominated their features, black and emotionless, reflecting the last rays of sunlight like polished obsidian. They had no hair, no ears that I could see, just smooth, pale skin stretched over bulbous heads. I froze, my hands gripping the sides of the boat so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to turn and row as fast as I could in the opposite direction, but I found myself paralyzed, unable to look away from these impossible creatures. They seemed to be watching me, their gaze penetrating and alien. I opened my mouth to shout, to call for help, but no sound came out. It was then that I felt it, a force unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. It started as a tingling sensation all over my body, like static electricity, but quickly intensified. Before I could even process what was happening, I felt myself being lifted out of the boat. The fishing rod slipped from my grasp, clattering to the bottom of the vessel as I rose higher and higher into the air. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely powerless, suspended above the water by some invisible energy that defied all logic and reason. As I hung there, helpless and terrified, I became aware of a low humming sound filling the air. It seemed to vibrate through my entire body, growing louder with each passing second. That's when I saw it, a massive, gleaming craft materializing above me as if from thin air. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, not in movies or even in my wildest dreams. The object was disc-shaped, easily the size of a football field, with a metallic surface that seemed to ripple and shift like liquid mercury. Lights pulsed along its edges in patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. I wanted to scream, to thrash against the invisible force holding me, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch in horror as I was drawn inexorably upward towards the imposing vessel. The beings on the shore hadn't moved, their enormous eyes still fixed on me as I ascended. As I neared the underside of the craft, a circular opening appeared, bathing me in a sickly green light. The humming intensified, becoming a physical sensation that rattled my teeth and made my vision blur. In that moment, as the reality of what was happening truly hit me, I felt a wave of terror so profound it threatened to overwhelm my consciousness. This couldn't be real, I told myself. This had to be some kind of vivid nightmare. But the cool metal against my skin as I passed through, the opening in the craft was undeniably, horrifyingly real. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was my little boat, bobbing alone on the waves far below, a testament to the normal life I was leaving behind. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a room that defied all logic and reason. The walls, if you could call them that, seemed to pulse with an inner light, shifting and morphing in patterns that made my head spin. The floor beneath me was smooth and slightly warm, almost organic in texture. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if I were moving through thick syrup. The air had a strange metallic taste that coated my tongue and made it difficult to breathe. As my eyes adjusted to the dim, pulsating light, I became aware of movement around me. The beings I had seen on the shore were here, gliding silently across the room with an otherworldly grace. Their skin, up close, had a translucent quality that revealed a network of veins and organs entirely alien to human anatomy. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to do anything to prove to myself that this wasn't happening, but my body remained paralyzed. One of the creatures approached me, its huge black eyes seeming to bore into my very soul. I felt a pressure in my head, a sensation of thoughts and images that weren't my own flooding my mind. They were trying to communicate, I realized with a jolt of terror and awe. But their concepts were so foreign, so utterly incomprehensible, that my brain struggled to process them. Flashes of stars, galaxies, and dimensions beyond my understanding flitted through my consciousness, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. The examination, if that's what it was, began without warning. Long, slender fingers with too many joints prodded at my skin, leaving trails of tingling sensation in their wake. I felt no pain, but the utter violation of my personal space and bodily autonomy was almost worse. Instruments that looked like a twisted hybrid of organic matter and advanced technology were brought out, hovering over me and emitting soft, pulsing lights. I could feel them scanning me, probing deeper than skin and muscle, as if they were mapping every atom of my being. Throughout it all, the beings communicated among themselves in a language of clicks and whistles that sounded more like music than speech. Time lost all meaning in that strange, shifting room. It could have been hours or days that I lay there, subjected to their inscrutable tests and procedures. At one point, I felt a sharp pain in my arm, the first real sensation since this ordeal began. I managed to turn my head just enough to see one of the creatures inserting a long, needle-like object into my flesh. A scream built up in my throat, but it came out as nothing more than a weak whimper. The being's huge eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of something. Not quite emotion, but a sense of purpose, of importance. Whatever they were doing, they believed it was necessary. That realization did little to comfort me as I watched a small, glowing object being pushed beneath my skin. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when I was sure my mind would shatter from the sheer alienness of it all, everything changed. The creatures stepped back, their movements suddenly more hurried. The humming that had been a constant background noise increased in pitch and intensity. The room around me began to blur, the pulsing lights speeding up until they were just streaks of color. I felt that strange lifting sensation again, and for one terrifying moment, I thought they were going to take me even further from home. But then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it was over. I found myself lying on the cool sand of the beach, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, a stark contrast to the otherworldly sounds I'd been subjected to. The night sky stretched above me, familiar constellations twinkling peacefully as if nothing had happened. I sat up slowly, my body aching as if I'd run a marathon. The beach was empty, no sign of the craft or the beings that had taken me. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all, if perhaps I'd fallen asleep in my boat and drifted to shore, my mind conjuring up fantastic explanations for lost time. But then I looked down at my arm, and my blood ran cold. There, just below, my elbow was a perfectly circular mark, smooth and slightly raised, unlike any scar I'd ever seen. It glowed faintly in the moonlight, a permanent reminder that what I had experienced was terrifyingly, undeniably real. I sat there on the beach for what felt like hours, my mind reeling as I tried to process what had just happened to me. The yite-ee sound of the waves, once so soothing, now seemed to mock me with their normalcy. How could the world just go on as if nothing had changed? when everything had changed for me. I couldn't shake the feeling of those alien eyes boring into me, the memory of their touch on my skin making me shudder uncontrollably. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I finally found the strength to stand on shaky legs. My clothes were damp with sea spray, and sand clung to every inch of me, but I barely noticed. I stumbled towards my house, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was I supposed to do now? Who could I tell? Would anyone even believe me? The walk home was a blur, my feet moving on autopilot while my thoughts raced. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the craft hovering there, ready to take me again. But the sky remained stubbornly empty, the stars fading as the sun rose. When I finally reached my front door, I realized I didn't have my keys. Of course not. They were still in the boat, wherever it had ended up. I let out a hysterical laugh at the absurdity of it all. Abducted by aliens, subjected to God knows what, and now locked out of my own house. I ended up breaking a window to get in, barely registering the sting of the glass cutting my hand. Once inside, I headed straight for the bathroom, an overwhelming need to scrub myself clean consuming me. I stripped off my salt-encrusted clothes and stepped into the shower, turning the water as hot as I could stand it. As the steam filled the small room, I began to sob uncontrollably. The reality of what had happened hit me in waves, each one threatening to drown me in despair and disbelief. I scrubbed my skin raw, as if I could somehow erase the memory of their touch, the feeling of alienness that seemed to cling to me. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't get rid of that strange mark on my arm. It stood out even more now, a perfect circle of smooth, slightly iridescent skin. I ran my fingers over it, half expecting it to hurt, but it was completely numb to the touch. What had they put inside me? What was its purpose? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. After what felt like hours, I finally stepped out of the shower, my skin red and tender from the scorching water and my frantic scrubbing. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at me. My eyes were wild, haunted by what they had seen. Dark circles stood out starkly against my pale skin, making me look years older than I had just yesterday morning. I stumbled to my bedroom, not bothering to dry off or put on clothes. I just needed to sleep, to escape from the nightmare my life had become, even if only for a few hours. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, felt the cold metal of their instruments on my skin. The worst part was the lingering sense of their minds touching mine. Fragments of the images and concepts they had tried to communicate flashed through my thoughts, too alien and vast for me to comprehend. Galaxies spanning distances I couldn't even fathom, technology that seemed more like magic, and a sense of purpose so profound it made my entire existence feel insignificant in comparison. I must have drifted off at some point because I jerked awake with a scream caught in my throat, my heart pounding. For a moment, I was back in that strange, pulsing room and panic gripped me. It took several long seconds for me to recognize my own bedroom, the familiar surroundings slowly coming into focus. The clock on my nightstand showed it was late afternoon. I had lost an entire day to fitful sleep and waking nightmares. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since before it happened. The thought of food made me nauseous. but I knew I needed to eat something to try and regain some semblance of normalcy. As I forced myself to eat a piece of toast, my mind kept circling back to the same questions. Should I tell someone? Would anyone believe me? The thought of being labeled as crazy, of potentially losing my job or alienating my friends and family, was almost as terrifying as what had happened to me. But the weight of this secret felt like it was crushing me. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, who might understand or at least listen without immediately dismissing me. That's when I remembered Juan, an old friend from school who had always been fascinated by UFOs and extraterrestrial life. We had drifted apart over the years, but I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to him. With shaking hands, I dialed his number, praying he still lived in town. When he answered, I almost broke down right there. "Juan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. Something happened to me. I don't know who else to turn to." There must have been something in my tone that conveyed the gravity of the situation, because Juan didn't hesitate. "Come over," he said, giving me his address. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." The drive to Juan's house was surreal. The world looked the same, people going about their daily lives, cars honking in traffic, the sun shining down on it all, but everything felt different. I kept expecting to see the craft appear in the sky, or to spot one of those beings walking down the street. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, and I flinched at every unexpected sound. When I finally arrived at Juan's modest home on the outskirts of town, I sat in the car for several long minutes, trying to gather the courage to go in. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was having some kind of mental breakdown? But I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed to tell someone, to have another person validate that what happened to me was real. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and walked to the front door. Before I could even knock, Juan opened it, concern etched on his face. "Jose," he said, taking in my haggard appearance, "what happened to you?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, I rolled up my sleeve, revealing the strange mark on my arm. Juan's eyes widened, and he quickly ushered me inside, closing the door behind us. Once inside, the words began to pour out of me in a torrent. I told Juan everything: the fishing trip, the beings on the beach, the craft, the examination room, the strange communication attempts. As I spoke, I watched his expression change from concern to disbelief, then to a mix of fear and excitement. He didn't interrupt, just listened intently, occasionally nodding or leaning in closer. When I finally finished, my throat raw from talking and from holding back tears, Juan sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Jose," he said slowly, "I've heard stories like this before, but I never thought I'd actually meet someone who..." He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the mark on my arm. "Can I?" he asked, gesturing towards it. I nodded, holding out my arm. Juan examined the mark closely, his fingers barely brushing the surface. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen," he murmured. "And you say they put something inside you?" I nodded, the memory making me shudder. "I don't know what it is or why they did it. I just know I felt something go in, and then this mark appeared." Juan sat back, his face serious. "Jose, what happened to you? It's incredible and terrifying. But you're not alone. There are others out there who have had similar experiences. We need to document this to get your story out there." The idea of sharing my experience with others filled me with a mix of relief and dread. On one hand, the thought of not having to bear this burden alone was tempting. On the other, I couldn't shake the fear of what might happen if my story got out. "I don't know, Juon," I said hesitantly. "What if they come back for me? What if telling people puts them in danger too?" Juon leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Look, I understand your fear, but think about it. If they wanted to keep this a secret, why would they have left such clear evidence?" He gestured to my arm. Maybe they want us to know. Maybe this is their way of making contact." His words struck a chord with me, reminding me of that strange sense of purpose I had felt during the encounter. Still, I wasn't entirely convinced. "Even if that's true," I argued, "who's going to believe us? The police? The media? They'll think we're crazy." Juon smiled grimly. "We start small. There are online communities, support groups for people who've had experiences like yours. We can share your story there, anonymously at first if you prefer. See what kind of response we get." As Juon spoke, I felt a strange mix of emotions washing over me. Part of me was terrified at the idea of reliving the experience by telling others, but another part felt an odd sense of excitement. The realization that I now possessed knowledge that few others on Earth had was both thrilling and overwhelming. I found myself nodding slowly. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it. But can we wait a few days? I need some time to process all of this." Juon agreed, and we spent the next few hours talking. He shared stories he had heard from other alleged abductees, pointing out similarities to my experience. As night fell, I felt a mixture of relief at having shared my secret and anxiety about what the future might hold. When I finally left Juon's house, the world seemed both larger and smaller than it had before. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had irrevocably changed. Every shadow seemed to hide potential watchers. Every sound outside my window made me tense up. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with vivid dreams of stars, strange planets, and those haunting alien eyes. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and introspection. I called in sick to work, unable to face the normalcy of my job when everything in my life felt so abnormal. I spent hours online, researching UFO sightings and abduction stories, looking for anything that might help me make sense of what had happened. Some of the accounts I read chilled me to the bone with their similarity to my own experience. Others seemed so outlandish that I found myself doubting everything, including my own memories. The mark on my arm remained unchanged, a constant reminder that I hadn't imagined it all. I found myself obsessively checking it, half expecting it to disappear or change. Sometimes late at night when the house was quiet, I swore I could feel something moving beneath my skin. But when I looked, there was nothing. I started to question everything. Every unusual sound, every flickering light. Was it just my heightened paranoia, or were they watching me? More than once, I caught myself staring up at the sky, a mixture of fear and longing twisting in my gut. Part of me was terrified they would return, but another part almost hoped they would. The glimpses I had seen of their knowledge, their technology, their understanding of the universe, it haunted me. I found myself hungry for more, even as I remained traumatized by the experience. A week after my encounter, I finally worked up the courage to return to the beach where it all happened. The sun was setting as I walked along the shore, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the craft. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of the ocean and the sky, turning brilliant shades of orange and pink. As I stood there, watching the waves crash against the shore, I was struck by how ordinary it all looked. How could this be the same place where my entire world had been turned upside down? I don't know how long I stood there, lost in thought, before I noticed something glinting in the sand near the water's edge. My heart racing, I approached it cautiously. There, half buried in the wet sand, was a small metallic object unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was about the size of a coin, but with an iridescent surface that seemed to shift colors as I turned it in my hand. With a jolt, I realized it was the same material as the craft that had taken me. As I stood there holding this impossible object, I was filled with a sense of both wonder and trepidation. This was proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that what had happened to me was real. But it was also a reminder that the universe was far vaster and more mysterious than I had ever imagined. As the last light of day faded and the first stars began to appear in the sky, I clutched the object tightly in my hand. Whatever happened next, whatever this new reality held for me, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The truth was out there, and somehow, for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom, I had become a part of it. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.